What if I told you that in ancient Rome a man could marry a woman for politics, sleep with men for pleasure, and still be celebrated as the ideal husband and ruler? In the world of the Caesars, marriage had nothing to do with love, loyalty, or emotional intimacy. It was a tool, a carefully negotiated alliance between families where affection was optional, but power was everything. This wasn't the exception. It was the norm. Behind the gilded masks of Roman matrimony were relationships shaped not by hearts but by hierarchies. Husbands were expected to cheat, wives were expected to endure, and fidelity was redefined as strategic discretion. In a society that glorified conquest of land, of status, of bodies, pleasure was political and intimacy was a performance. Affairs weren't whispered about in shame. They were worn like symbols of masculine success, whether with mistresses, courtesans, or young male lovers. And the most shocking part, this wasn't seen as moral failure, it was seen as social mastery. To truly understand Rome is to strip away everything we assume about love, gender, and relationships. Because in this empire, who you loved didn't matter. What mattered was who had the power. And sometimes the most powerful men were the ones who broke every rule and still rewrote the legacy of desire. This is not just ancient history. It's a mirror held up to our own ideas of strength, status, and the quiet cost of love traded for control. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't a celebration of love, it was a transaction of legacy. Two households didn't unite because of affection. They merged to consolidate land, forge alliances, and climb the social ladder. A Roman wedding was a strategy meeting disguised in ceremonial silk. For the elite, marrying well meant marrying smart, and that often meant marrying someone they neither loved nor desired. A young woman might be promised to a man twice her age while her husband's true passions lay far from the marriage bed. Infidelity wasn't scandalous, it was routine. Roman men openly kept mistresses, visited courtesans, and formed long-term relationships outside of marriage with both women and men. And no one batted an eye. What mattered wasn't faithfulness, it was appearances, offspring, and public power. The wife's role was symbolic: to provide heirs, maintain the family's image, and never interfere with her husband's personal pursuits. Love, if it happened, was a fortunate accident. But for most, marriage meant duty and discipline, not intimacy. This emotional detachment didn't weaken Rome, it helped build it. But beneath that cold efficiency was a quiet human cost, a generation raised in homes where partnership was political and affection was outsourced. The empire was strong, the families within it often less so. In ancient Rome, identity wasn't about who you loved, it was about who held control. Unlike today's world, where sexual orientation is framed around personal identity, gay, straight, bisexual, the Romans saw desire through the lens of dominance and submission. Power was the real currency. A man could sleep with both women and men without ever questioning his masculinity, as long as he played the dominant role. To penetrate was to rule. To be penetrated, especially as an adult male, was to risk shame and social ridicule. It wasn't the gender of your lover that defined you, but the role you took. The same act could either elevate or humiliate you depending on your position. Roman society was obsessed with hierarchy, and the bedroom was just another battlefield where power was displayed and reinforced. Even in relationships between men, the older partner, the pederasty, was expected to be the teacher, the mentor, the leader. The younger, usually a teenager, was the receiver not just of affection, but of influence. These dynamics were woven into Roman law, art, and everyday life. They shaped reputations and political careers. In this world, desire wasn't deviant, it was strategic. Love was not about equality, it was about control. And every intimate act came with a silent calculation. In the Roman world, relationships between older men and adolescent boys were not only tolerated, they were institutionalized. Known as pederasty, these bonds were seen as a rite of passage for the elite. An older man, often a statesman or scholar, would take on a teenage boy as a protege. But this mentorship wasn't limited to education or politics. It extended into emotional and often sexual territory, wrapped in the language of guidance and honor. The boy, usually in his early to mid-teens, was expected to learn how to carry himself in society, from rhetoric to strategy, from war to wit. but also how to navigate desire and power. This wasn't seen as exploitation. On the contrary, it was portrayed as cultivation, a way to shape the future ruling class through intimacy with their predecessors. The relationship was meant to end when the boy came of age, stepping into his own masculine role in society. What strikes the modern mind as predatory or abusive was, in Roman eyes, noble. The practice offered young men access to powerful networks and a fast track into public life. But beneath that polished logic was a darker reality, a culture where age, hierarchy, and affection blurred, and where the line between mentorship and possession was dangerously thin. In ancient Rome, the bond between an older man and a teenage boy was often framed as a noble exchange, wisdom for beauty, protection for loyalty. This was the structure of pederasty, a practice seen in aristocratic circles as a vital part of elite male development. The older partner, typically in his 30s or 40s, was called the erastes, the guide, the provider, the symbol of masculine authority. The younger, the eromenos, was expected to be graceful, intelligent, and attentive. On the surface, it was about mentorship, but under that mentorship lay an unspoken contract of intimacy. This relationship wasn't hidden in shame. In fact, it was often praised in Roman literature and sculpture as a harmonious blend of love and education. But the reality was far more complex. These boys, often no older than 14 or 15, entered the world of adult politics, war, and desire long before they were ready. For many, it offered social elevation and security. For others, it marked the loss of innocence under the weight of elite expectation. Roman society justified it as a cultural tradition. Yet behind the marble statues and noble rhetoric was a system that blurred affection with obligation and left many young lives shaped by a power they were never old enough to fully understand. In Rome's corridors of power, desire didn't just follow the rules, it made them. Among emperors, senators, and generals, having lovers outside of marriage wasn't just common, it was a sign of status. A powerful man could have a wife, a mistress, and a male companion, and no one would question his morality. The lines between fidelity and freedom were redrawn not by love, but by hierarchy. For the Roman elite, marriage fulfilled a duty to society while passion was pursued elsewhere. What shocks modern audiences is how openly these arrangements were discussed and accepted. Roman men might share their lives with one person, but share their intimacy with many, and not in secret. Affairs with courtesans were celebrated in poetry, and relationships with male partners were carved into stone. Even among Rome's most revered leaders, these patterns held. Julius Caesar was rumored to have had male lovers. Cicero, the great orator, joked openly about the romantic escapades of politicians. But behind these public displays was a deeper truth. Same-sex relationships were sometimes seen as a safer alternative. In an era without birth control, where childbirth was dangerous, and often deadly, male lovers were viewed as a form of protection, an early, pragmatic form of population control. In this world, pleasure didn't threaten duty, it often protected it. Among all Roman emperors, few embodied the intersection of power and forbidden love more intimately than Hadrian. Officially, he was married to Vibia Sabina, a political match arranged for appearances and lineage. But by most historical accounts, theirs was a marriage in name only. The true center of Hadrian's emotional world was a young Greek boy named Antinous. Beautiful, sharp-witted, and poised beyond his years, Antinous was not just a companion, he became the emperor's obsession. They traveled together across the empire, from the temples of Greece to the sands of Egypt, drawing whispers and awe wherever they went. Unlike most Roman rulers who kept male lovers in the shadows, Hadrian placed Antinous in the light. He gave him tutors, dressed him in imperial colors, and even allowed him to be painted alongside gods. But their love story ended in tragedy. In the year 130 AD, during a voyage on the Nile, Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was an accident. Others believe it was a ritual sacrifice. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was devastated. In his grief, he did what no Roman had done before: he deified the boy. Cities were named after him. Statues were erected across the empire. Coins bore his image. A mortal lover became a god, and Rome for a time worshipped heartbreak. If Hadrian turned grief into worship, Nero turned desire into theater. No Roman emperor pushed the boundaries of identity, spectacle, and scandal quite like he did. While most rulers kept their lovers behind palace walls, Nero staged entire performances out of his relationships. In one of the most infamous episodes of his reign, Nero married a man named Pythagoras. But Nero did not assume the role of husband. He wore a bridal veil, dressed in fine lace, and publicly played the bride. Witnesses claimed the ceremony was complete with vows, a dowry, and a banquet, as if it were any traditional Roman wedding. The empire watched in stunned confusion. An emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, was now playing wife to a former slave. But Nero wasn't done. Not long after, he married another man, a young boy named Sporus. This time, the roles reversed. Nero played the groom and forced Sporus to live as his wife in public. He even had the child castrated to make his appearance more feminine, a grotesque manipulation of youth and identity carried out for image and control. To Nero, love was never just personal, it was political theater, and he demanded the empire applaud no matter how grotesque the act. While Nero blurred the lines between performance and cruelty, Chapter 7 plunges deeper into the darkest corners of imperial Rome, where power was no longer disguised as affection, but weaponized as control. The whispers surrounding Nero's relationship with his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, are among the most disturbing in Roman history. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Tacitus suggested that Agrippina, determined to maintain influence over her son after he became emperor, may have seduced him, or at the very least allowed their closeness to appear inappropriate. Whether true or politically motivated slander, the rumor of incest became a tool of character assassination used by Nero's enemies to strip him of moral legitimacy. In Roman society, sexual scandal wasn't just gossip, it was strategy. Accusations like these could destroy careers, rewrite legacies, and fracture dynasties. But while Nero's story was layered in rumor and theatrical excess, Emperor Tiberius offers a more chilling example of depravity hidden behind marble walls. In his later years, Tiberius withdrew to the island of Capri, building secluded villas far from the public eye. There, according to multiple historical accounts, he surrounded himself with young boys brought in as servants, but allegedly used for gratification. Roman historians claimed these boys were subjected to unspeakable abuse, their innocence consumed in the shadow of unchecked power. While some details may have been exaggerated by hostile writers, the overall pattern remains disturbing. Tiberius's name became synonymous with excess cruelty and the slow moral decay of absolute authority. In Rome, the higher a man climbed, the more the boundaries of decency bent beneath his feet. On the island of Capri, Emperor Tiberius built more than villas. He built a world without consequence. Far removed from the Senate, from public scrutiny, and from any form of accountability, Capri became a sanctuary where one man's will replaced law. Roman historians describe it as a paradise twisted into a private prison. Behind high walls and ocean cliffs, the emperor indulged in pleasures the capital could never permit. Boys, some barely into adolescence, were brought in under the pretense of servitude. But what they endured was far more sinister. Ancient accounts, particularly from Suetonius, allege grotesque acts, children forced to perform for the emperor's amusement, their bodies treated as instruments of power rather than human beings. Whether every detail was factual or exaggerated, the truth was clear: Tiberius had built a kingdom of silence. No one dared question the emperor, and those who did never returned from the island. Even Rome, a city accustomed to indulgence, found whispers from Capri chilling. In time, the word Capri itself became shorthand for unspeakable corruption. And yet the empire endured, fed by taxes, sustained by legions, and blind to the rot at its core. Capri was not just Tiberius's retreat. It was Rome's reflection, revealing what happens when power answers to no one but itself. In the end, Rome didn't collapse under the weight of foreign enemies. It crumbled from within, hollowed out by a culture that confused power with virtue and pleasure with privilege. The empire that once prided itself on order, discipline, and glory became a stage where unchecked desire ruled behind marble facades. In a society where love was commodified, bodies were traded for favor, and youth was sacrificed to appetite, even the most sacred bonds, marriage, family, mentorship, became tools of domination. The ruling class, shielded by status and tradition, rewrote morality to suit their needs. Castration became ceremony. Incest became rumor weaponized. Abuse was buried beneath titles and triumphs. But beneath all the grandeur lay a truth too fragile to face when control becomes the only form of love. A society understands that society forgets how to care, how to protect, and ultimately how to survive. Rome taught the world how to build empires, but it also left behind a warning carved into its ruins that no civilization, however mighty, can endure when power is worshipped more than people. The legacy of Rome is not just one of conquest. It's a reminder of what we become when humanity is reduced to hierarchy and when no one dares to say no to a king who demands everything. Rome did not fall in a single night. It decayed slowly from the inside out through whispered indulgences, normalized abuse, and power worshipped without restraint. Behind the marble temples and golden thrones were broken boys, silenced wives and rulers who believed their pleasure was law. The empire taught the world architecture, warfare, and law, but also left behind a darker lesson. When desire becomes unchecked and power goes unchallenged, even the greatest civilizations rot. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. Because any society that forgets the value of dignity over dominance is always one generation away from collapse.